Okay, welcome everybody. Uh, let's go ahead and get started. Just a quick reminder, please make sure your audio is muted so we can hear the speaker without any interruptions. If you have any questions for the end of the session, please just go ahead and type them into chat. And with that, I will let Matthew take it away.
Great, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this discussion of the two plots problem dealing with death and crime in a Martian colony. I am Matthew Kenyon, and I'm going to be your guide as we take a look into what future colonists might face as they settle the Red Planet. Now, the first question you're probably asking is, what the heck is the two plots problem? Well, the inspiration for the title comes from a passage in Nathaniel Hawthorne's classic, The Scarlet Letter. The founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized that among their earliest practical necessities, to allot a portion of the virgin soil as a cemetery and another portion as the site of a prison. So these are the two plots, a place for criminals and a place for the deceased. Now, obviously, a small Martian colony might not have space for actual physical plots, but the basic premise still remains. What do we do when someone dies, and what do we do when there is a crime? According to Hawthorne, these are both inevitable in any colony, and I think many people would agree. Elon Musk certainly does. And in August of 2019, we may have had our first crime in space when NASA astronaut McClain was accused of accessing the bank accounts of her former spouse while orbiting Earth on the ISS. Crime and death have also shown up in some of the most remote places here on Earth, including in research stations in Antarctica. The ISS and Antarctic research stations are filled with scientists, astronauts, and other professionals we typically don't think of as would-be criminals. But there is still crime. And as we know, no one is immune to death. So I think it's fair to say that any Martian colony of adequate size will also see its share of crime and death, regardless of how carefully prospective colonists are selected. So what do we do about it? I think many people's first instinct is just to, well, bring them home. Somebody dies, you bring them back to Earth. Someone commits a crime, just send them back. And that might be plausible for astronauts on the ISS or even a colony on the moon, but it's just not realistic for a colony on Mars. Not only would you need to be within the right transfer window, but you'd also need a ship standing by that you didn't mind losing for a few years. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and it's likely just not worth the effort. So bringing them back to Earth is likely out. What if we just let the colonists handle it on their own? I mean, they're a robust group of people. They're adapting to living on this alien planet, so surely they can handle a minor crime or a death. These are some of the best guesses out there for what would happen if we just left it up to the colonists. Despite the existence of many laws and treaties governing space activities, it's really hard to believe that colonists would just phone up lawyers back on Earth to solve their problems. Instead, our best indication of what will happen is what has happened in the past. In times of crisis, people tend to fall back on what they know. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Martian colonists default to something similar to what they learned or experienced on Earth. So let's look into some of the most likely outcomes of this laissez-faire approach to the two plots problem. One of the most commonly cited outcomes for dealing with crime in a Martian colony is the idea of frontier justice, reminiscent of the Wild West. This idea has been explored in countless works of science fiction, but it is a real and possibly the most realistic outcome. With no laws, policies, or structures in place to respond to crime, it will be the fastest gun, or the strongest person, or the most influential who wields power. Individuals would decide who should and shouldn't be punished and what that punishment would be. This not only results in a fear will keep them in line approach to crime, but it also allows for favoritism, bribery, and corruption. In short, we'd probably like to avoid a Wild West situation in a colony that's just struggling to survive. If a colony is owned by a corporation, and especially if that corporation is using the colony for manufacturing, mining, or research, They will likely decide to staff the colony with some sort of private security. Before police forces were common in the US, companies would hire their own security to protect their factories and warehouses against theft. This trend continues today, with private companies spending billions each year to protect their investments. Private security officers, however, are beholden to their employer, meaning their number one priority will likely be protecting property over anything else. While this may be good for the company, it is not the best way to protect the people of a budding colony. Militias or vigilantism are both based on the idea that in a power vacuum, non-professionals will take charge and respond to crime as they see fit. This could look like the aforementioned frontier justice. It could be volunteer watch groups or even just angry mobs. In all cases, however, you have untrained individuals deciding right and wrong with no guiding framework. This has led some to call for artificial intelligence as a way to increase objectivity. But I think human nature and a terrifying array of movies will not endear people to submit to our new robot overlords. Switching to the other side now. When somebody dies, it's likely that the first place they'll be taken to is a hospital or whatever medical facility is available. While these locations may be the best suited to handle a body, they are not a solution for long-term storage of the deceased. The last thing you want is a decomposing body in the place where you're trying to cure the sick or to heal wounds. Burial is a popular option here on Earth, but it would likely require some specialized equipment or training on Mars. It's certainly a viable option, but there are still many questions to answer before we can ensure it is the best option. Cremation is not likely viable as it requires large amounts of energy to sustain the temperatures necessary to reduce a body to ash. That energy would have to come from somewhere, and I just don't foresee colonists lighting up the engines of their return ship just to dispose of a body. Abandonment or simply leaving bodies somewhere on the surface is a likely outcome, though recent work suggests that bodies on Mars would not decompose and would rather mummify, leading to quite the scene on the surface of the red planet. What all of these potential outcomes have in common is that they require some planning and foresight to ensure they don't end in anarchy or persecution or something straight out of a horror movie. So leaving it up to the colonists just to figure it out in a moment of crisis is not really a viable solution. We need a plan. In today's presentation, I am proposing a three-phase plan for the two plots problem. Number one, to date, I don't think anyone has asked the right questions. And if you're not asking the right questions, you won't come up with the right answers. Number two, once you know the questions, you can start to look into what potential answers might be. And then finally, you can use those potential answers to establish a framework to guide the future colonists. Notice that nowhere do I mention solving the two plots problem. That's not the goal of this project. The project was designed to create a framework to guide future colonists while still allowing them to develop their own solutions. I don't think it's appropriate for me or for anyone else to tell a future Martian colonist what they should be doing when there's just still so many unknowns about what the colony will look like. I think they should decide this based on their mission and, more importantly, the values of the people who will be there. So what I want to do with this project is provide a framework of options so they can choose what's best and understand the implications of their choice. So let's get into it. My approach starts with asking the right questions. Now, that might seem silly, but I've searched through everything I can find on death and crime in a Martian, lunar, or space-based colony, and I'm not convinced anyone has quite figured it out yet. I think the main reason is that they simply start with the wrong questions. So let me explain a little bit. These are our primary questions, the two things we want the answers to. How should we respond to death, and how should we respond to crime? Now, just asking them like this isn't good enough. Broad, complex questions need to be broken down into their constituent parts in order to truly answer them. Once you get deep enough, the answer to these smaller questions will imply answers to these larger questions. So we can answer these questions only by first figuring out what they really are asking about. But before we can even do that, we need to decide on an approach. That is, what type of questions we should be asking. When I've mentioned this project to others, their first reaction is usually to approach the problem from a logistics standpoint. That is, they start asking questions about what we need to solve the two plots problem. Do we need a police force? Do we need new laws? Do we need to train people to dig graves? The problem here is that determining what we need is actually the second step. And this is what I mean when I say people have not yet asked the right questions. They ask questions about logistics and assume the answer to the second type of questions, that is, the philosophical questions. Here, we ask questions not about what we need, but about what we value. So back to our two primary questions here. How do we turn these into philosophical questions? Here are some examples of what it looks like to start breaking down a big question into multiple smaller questions. Notice that these questions aren't logistical. They don't ask if we need a cremation chamber or how many police officers we should have. However, they're not really philosophical either. They don't get to core values, but they do start to show us the path to reaching those philosophical questions. These are actually normative questions. They ask about the way things should be. They touch on values, but they don't directly ask about them. For example, what you consider to be a crime will in part be based on what you value in life. If you enjoy drinking a beer after a hard day's work, you probably don't want to consider drinking alcohol a crime. These questions are a great step in breaking our two big questions down into smaller pieces, but they still just scratch the surface. To really understand how we can manage death and crime in a Martian colony, we need to dig a little deeper. These are the type of questions that I want to focus on. They get to the core of a person's values. They aren't easy questions for anyone to answer, but exploring the answers will really help to inform those secondary questions. And those in turn help to answer our primary questions. So let's dig in a little bit on these questions. What is justice? People say they want to see justice served or want to live in a just world. But what justice means is highly individualistic. A lot of times we just assume that when we call for justice, others are on the same page. But justice isn't one thing. It can mean different things to different people in different circumstances. For example, retributive justice occurs when there's a punishment for the offender. This is what we typically think of as justice, when someone who has committed a crime is given some sort of punishment. Redemptive justice is the idea that the offender should redeem themselves in some way, such that they contribute to the good of society. So this might be something like performing a community service to give back to society. Rehabilitative justice occurs when an offender has changed their ways and no longer commits criminal acts. In this case, it's less about what was done in the past and more about what they're going to do in the future. Restorative justice is all about making the victim whole again. So, for example, if you broke something, it's paying to fix that thing you broke. Factual justice prioritizes uncovering the truth over anything else. So in these cases, again, it's less about what happened and more important that people have learned about what happened. I think the best example of this is a political scandal. When it breaks, it's important that people have learned what has been going on. Procedural justice is all about having a fair process, focuses less on the outcomes of what's going on and more making sure the process is fair for everybody. And then last, there's this idea of public safety, which is justice is only served when public safety has actually improved. So again, it's looking towards the future and looking for what things have changed to make sure the public is safer. As you've probably noticed, Some of these visions of justice focus on individual cases, while others focus on justice systems as a whole. Building a justice system requires understanding what justice means to the people who are beholden to that system, and it will include elements of justice that impact individual cases as well as the entire system. How do we weigh our idea of justice with the good of the colony? Let's say our new colony's justice system just found someone guilty of assault and punishes them with a month of hard labor. That might be fine from a justice perspective, but what if that person is the doctor or the chef or the engineer tasked with ensuring the drinking water is clean? Losing them for a month would cause more harm than good. We must consider not only what our sense of justice is, but also when we'd be willing to suspend justice for the good of the colony. The same goes for individual rights. When should individual rights take priority, and when should the good of the colony prevail? How much room is there for individual rights when every day is just a struggle? How will this change as the colony matures? Can we justify killing someone? Is life in and of itself sacred? Is it ever right to take life? Can you ever have justice by taking a life? All of these questions about the justification of killing, they really hint at an underlying theme, and that theme is how we should value life. Now, philosophers have long thought about assigning value to a human life. One of the most famous examples is by way of the runaway trolley thought experiment. So it goes a little bit like this. The trolley is running away down the track, and it will hit 5 people if nothing is done. You stand at a switch that will allow you to divert the trolley onto another track where it will only hit 1 person. What do you do? Well, unsurprisingly, most people say they would divert the trolley. We generally feel that 5 lives hold a greater value than 1. But it's seldom that simple. What if the 1 person is a loved one, a family member or a close friend? Does that change your valuation? What if the 1 person is a child and the 5 are elderly? How about if the 5 are unskilled laborers and the 1 is the only doctor in the colony? Now, if you think that's complicated, you should try this thought experiment with the doctor on 1 track and your mother on another. Could you really pull the switch to kill your own mother? You may notice that these are all questions with no one right answer, which is probably why people have avoided them. Asking about values will always be tricky, but it's definitely worth the effort. If you know the colonists' views on justice, it's easy to figure out what the potential punishment for a crime should be. If you know their thoughts on the value of a life, hard decisions about who gets the last of the food or water become a little easier. These questions also show where death and crime start to overlap. In fact, I would argue that many aspects of a new colony boil down to just a few fundamental questions about values. Answer these questions, and you've figured out the foundation for your societal institutions. Understand the colonists' values, and the hard questions become a little easier. If you're excited to hear the answers to these questions, I'm sorry. I hate to disappoint, but this project has yet to uncover the values of a future Martian colony. The good news is that we have our questions. At least we have some of them. And unfortunately, that's as far as this project has made it over the past year. The last 2 phases are the things that will be done over the course of several more years, and those are the real core of this project. So let's outline what those last 2 phases will look like. First, I think it's important to reiterate that only the colonists can provide the actual answers to these questions. We can only figure out the universe of possible answers. We also need to remember that people are not monolithic, even Martian colonists. They won't all agree on the answer. They will have different values. Finding a way to reach consensus will be a real challenge. But they will face many challenges over their time on the Red Planet, and figuring out how to deal with dissent is critical for an array of situations. So while I feel there won't be a consensus at first, I do believe it is something they will develop through their training, as it is a critical skill for surviving in such a harsh environment. So given that, what do we do now for this phase of the project? I think the first step is to survey and interview astronauts, engineers, and anyone who says they would be willing to travel to Mars. While most of their responses would probably line up with the general public, I think there's still exciting things we can learn from this group. Getting better insight into the values of these people who might be the first to colonize Mars can help point us in the direction of the most probable answers, which can help us to develop the best solutions. Having analog astronauts or those in space work through various scenarios can also provide new insights as to how colonists might reach consensus and weigh complex decisions. I would also love to get 100 or so people, put them in a room, and get them to problem solve things. Tell them that someone was found dead and they don't know what happened. How would they tackle that problem? What would the values be that would bubble up to the surface in that type of situation? Would those values look different from the values they said when they were answering a survey? Last, I love the idea of wargaming the situation. So you bring in experts to play various roles and have them think through these scenarios. I know that nothing we can do here will perfectly replicate what a colonist might experience, but I think it's way better to try and have at least some semblance of an idea than to go in completely blind. The final phase is to take all of those potential answers and develop them into a framework. Once we know the potential answers, we can construct systems and institutions that respond to those answers. If we know what future colonists think about justice, we can design an array of justice systems that respond to those values. All of these designs make up the framework, which you can think of as like a Martian handbook of sorts. It would describe how the systems work, and ways to what potential concerns might be with that system, and ways to mitigate those concerns. During training, future colonists could discuss and debate their values and answers to the various questions. These answers would be used to decide on systems and institutions that fit best for the colony by comparing them with the listings in the framework. While this is not a ready-made out-of-the-box answer, they will find that much of the legwork has already been done researching and cataloging the options. The goal here is to make things easier for the colonists and whoever is putting them on Mars. The more we can do ahead of time, the easier this will be for everyone, and the more likely we'll have success. I'll leave you with just a few final thoughts. As you can tell, this project is just getting started. I've thought up some of the initial questions to answer, but I'm sure that there are more. And there's been no work yet on gathering possible answers or building out the framework. The good news is that we still have some time, but this project will take years to complete. Ideally, it will be done well before any colonists are even picked, so the findings can be incorporated into the planning and training for the first colony. This project will also require quite a few resources, many more than I alone have. So if it interests you, then please contact me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So thank you all for attending. If there are any questions, you can put them in the chat. I'm happy to have them now, or you can always reach me through my website or through email. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Obviously, something that needs to be thought of. So just a quick reminder, any questions anybody has, please put them into chat. And we'll go ahead and start with, scroll up here. So consensus is fleeting and it evolves with the culture and circumstances. No absolute answers are possible for all occasions. Therefore, what mechanisms can be devised to incorporate these facts with minimal social disruption?
So I completely agree. These situations aren't something where you can just have a solution that you can go to. And the idea of the framework is not to have all the answers, but it's to have kind of a guiding way to help people make decisions. Because as we've seen throughout our history, things change rapidly and we are constantly responding to these changes. So we need systems that are flexible enough that people can use them to solve their problems and to come up with solutions that work. But I think that having some type of guiding framework in place will help them to make those decisions. As far as the consensus goes, I agree. It's not going to be there at first, but I think that people will find a way to reach consensus because they're naturally going to need some sort of order. And how that changes over time, it will change. And that's why I agree there needs to be flexibility built in. So the idea is definitely to allow for as much flexibility as possible.
Okay, next question is, do we want morals to be easy? Is there some more detail on exactly what you mean by easy? That's from Stephen.
While Stephen's responding, I can say that I don't want morals to be easy, and I don't think morals are easy. And I think part of the value that groups of people have is having different views and different morals. And the idea with these type of deep moral questions isn't to find a perfect answer. It's to say, what are all of the possible answers? And then how can we reconcile that universe of possible answers out there into something that is a framework that could help to guide people?
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Next question. How can flexibility and resilience be built into structures to handle changing circumstances over time, e.g. a colony becoming safer and more established?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges, definitely as a colony becomes more established, the values of the people will change, I think, and the systems they want in place will change. And we've seen this here on Earth. Our systems change over time. They kind of go through these incremental changes every so often. We try and improve them a little bit. So, like I said, you do need that flexibility built in from the start. And that's why the framework is important, is because it's not dictating this is what you do. It's saying, here are the options of what you can do, and pick what you need. And as the colony grows and as it matures, I do see it switching a little bit from that kind of frontier justice idea where everyone's kind of just struggling to survive into a more stable colony where people now start to think about individual values as gaining importance. And I think we've seen that in many places where once you kind of surpass those basic needs, the goal of what you want to accomplish with a justice system or a system aimed at handling death, those things start to change. So definitely, yes, a lot of flexibility needs to be built in because there is so much change that will happen.
So we got time for one more question. I know there's some more in here that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But here the next question is it not possible to see multiple settlements on Mars with each with differing values? Is there a framework that would help each of these find their local optimum consensus?
Yes, and that is a great question because the whole purpose of this project is to provide that array of answers and of different options, because I do feel that if there are multiple colonies, they will be different, they will have different values, they will have different needs, and the worst thing we can do is tell everyone, this is your one solution. Everybody has to do the same thing. I mean, the same goes for if there's a colony on the moon or if there's an O'Neill cylinder out there with a separate colony. You can't tell all of these colonies to do the same thing, and you definitely can't have someone back on Earth trying to dictate that to those colonies. So flexibility is key, and allowing each colony to do what they need to do.
Thank you for your time and for your questions, and we will hopefully see all of you in the next session.
Thank you, everyone.